Before we begin tonight's journey, take a slow breath in and gently breathe out. Tonight, we will listen to 3 timeless Zen stories, simple stories that carry quiet wisdom. Stories about fear, uncertainty, and the power of the present moment. First, we will hear the story called The Monk and the Strawberry. Then we will travel to a quiet village for the famous Zen story, Maybe, the Farmer and the Horse. And finally, we will climb into the mountains of Japan for a powerful lesson called The Samurai and the Monk, Heaven and Hell. So now, let your mind slow down and let the first story begin. Long ago, deep within a vast mountain forest, where mist drifted slowly between the ancient trees, there stood a small monastery, hidden from the noise of the world. The monks who lived there followed a life of silence, meditation, and simplicity.
They believed that true peace was not something found in wealth or power, but something discovered inside the mind. Among them lived one monk who was especially calm and wise. He was known for his gentle smile and the quiet way he moved through the world. While others spoke often about enlightenment, he preferred to experience it through the rhythm of nature itself. Every day, he would walk far beyond the monastery walls. He would wander along narrow mountain paths, through tall bamboo groves, and across clear streams that sang softly over smooth stones. For him, these walks were not merely exercise, they were meditation in motion. He would pause to watch the wind ripple through the leaves. He would listen to the distant call of birds echoing through the valley. Sometimes he would sit for long stretches beside a river, watching the water flow endlessly past.
To the monk, every moment was a teacher. The rustling forest, the shifting clouds, even the silence itself, all of it reminded him of a simple truth. Life was always changing, and peace came from accepting that change. One afternoon, as the sun slowly lowered behind the mountains, the monk set out on another walk along a narrow path carved into the side of a steep cliff. The air was cool, the forest was unusually quiet, and for a while, the only sound was the soft crunch of his sandals on the dusty path. But suddenly, the stillness of the mountain shattered. From somewhere deep within the forest came a terrifying roar. A tiger! The sound echoed through the valley like thunder. The monk stopped instantly. His heart began to pound. Slowly, he turned around, and there, emerging from the trees behind him, was a massive tiger, its eyes fixed directly on him.
Hungry, silent, and already beginning to move. For a brief moment, the monk and the tiger simply stared at one another. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The monk had spent years training his mind to remain calm, to observe fear without being controlled by it. But in that instant, the reality before him was undeniable. This was no ordinary moment of meditation. This was survival. The tiger took a slow step forward, then another. Its muscles rippled beneath its striped fur, and its heavy paws pressed silently into the dirt of the narrow mountain path. The monk felt the ancient instinct of every living creature awaken inside him. Run! Without another thought, he turned and began to run along the cliffside path. His robe fluttered wildly behind him as his sandals struck the ground.
The path twisted sharply along the mountain, barely wide enough for a single person. Behind him, the tiger burst into motion. Branches snapped, leaves scattered. The thunder of the tiger's pursuit echoed through the forest. The monk ran faster than he had ever run in his life. His breath grew heavy, his legs burned. The edge of the cliff loomed dangerously close beside him, dropping hundreds of feet into the valley below. But there was nowhere else to go. Suddenly, the path ended. Ahead of him stood a steep cliff wall with no way forward. The monk spun around. The tiger was already closing the distance, its golden eyes locked onto him. For a split second, despair flashed through his mind. Then he noticed something, a thick vine hanging down the side of the cliff. Without hesitation, the monk rushed forward and grabbed it. With all his strength, he swung himself over the edge and began lowering his body down the rocky cliff face. Above him, the tiger arrived at the edge only seconds later. It roared in frustration, its massive head peering over the cliff. The monk clung tightly to the vine, his body dangling in the open air. The cold rock scraped against his feet as he steadied himself. For a moment, it seemed he had escaped, but when he carefully looked down, his heart nearly stopped. At the base of the cliff, pacing slowly among the rocks, was another tiger. This one had already noticed him. It circled patiently, its tail swaying back and forth as if waiting for something inevitable. Now the monk hung suspended between two dangers. Above him, the tiger. Below him, another tiger. No path upward, no path downward, only the fragile vine holding his life in place.
The monk hung silently from the vine. The wind brushed gently against the cliffside, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. For a few moments, everything felt strangely still. Above him, the tiger continued pacing at the edge of the cliff, occasionally letting out a low growl of frustration. Below him, the second tiger moved slowly among the rocks, its eyes fixed upward, waiting patiently. The monk understood the situation clearly now. If he climbed up, the tiger above would strike. If he let go, the tiger below would surely catch him. There was no escape. He was suspended between two dangers, held in place by nothing more than a single vine and the strength of his tired hands. His heart pounded loudly in his chest. Fear rose inside him like a wave. But the monk had spent many years observing the nature of the mind. He knew how fear worked. First, it arrives as a sudden shock. Then it grows, filling the imagination with endless possibilities of suffering. But if one simply watches it, calmly, quietly, something curious happens. Fear slowly loses its power.
The monk closed his eyes for a moment and took a slow breath. Then another. The forest sounds gradually returned to him. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, the whisper of the wind against the cliff. Life, it seemed, continued as usual, even in the middle of danger. As he opened his eyes again, something small caught his attention. Just beside him, growing from a tiny crack in the cliff wall, was a small wild plant. Its leaves were delicate and green, and hanging from one thin stem was a single ripe strawberry, bright red, perfectly round, glistening slightly in the fading light of the afternoon sun. The monk blinked in surprise. Of all the things he expected to see in such a moment, a strawberry was certainly not one of them. The monk continued to hang from the vine, his body swaying slightly against the cliff. Above him, the tiger still waited. Below him, the other tigers circled patiently among the rocks. Nothing about his situation had changed. He was still trapped, still suspended between two certain dangers.
Yet his attention slowly drifted away from the tigers. Instead, it settled on the tiny plant growing from the cliff wall and the single red strawberry. It looked impossibly vivid against the gray stone, bright, fresh, alive. For a long moment, the monk simply stared at it. Then something unexpected happened. He began to smile.
How strange life could be. At a moment when death seemed only seconds away, the universe had placed a small, perfect strawberry within his reach. The monk shifted his grip on the vine and carefully extended one hand. The wind brushed softly against his face as his fingers reached toward the fruit. The cliff beneath him seemed endless. The tigers continued to wait. But in that moment, the monk was no longer thinking about them. His attention rested entirely on the small fruit before him. His fingers gently plucked the strawberry from the vine. He held it in his hand for a second, admiring its color and shape. Then slowly, he brought it to his mouth. He took a bite. The sweetness burst across his tongue. Fresh, juicy, perfect. The monk closed his eyes, and for that single moment, there was no cliff, no tigers, no fear. There was only the taste of the strawberry and the simple joy of being alive in that very instant. How sweet, the monk whispered softly.
The monk continued to hang from the vine, the taste of the strawberry still lingering softly in his mouth. Above him, the tiger remained at the cliff's edge. Below him, the other tiger still waited patiently among the rocks. Nothing about the danger had disappeared. The situation was still exactly the same. Yet something inside the monk had changed. His mind was no longer racing with fear. Instead, it had become calm, clear, and strangely peaceful. Because in that brief moment when he tasted the strawberry, he had remembered something very important. Life is always uncertain. Danger can appear at any time. And sometimes, like the monk hanging between the two tigers, we find ourselves trapped between worries about the future and regrets about the past. The tiger above us might represent the problems chasing us. The tiger below might represent the fears waiting for us ahead. And the vine we cling to might feel fragile, like the uncertain thread of life itself. Yet even in the middle of all that uncertainty, there are still strawberries.
Hopefully, small moments of beauty, a breath of fresh air, the warmth of sunlight, the laughter of someone we love, the quiet peace of a single present moment. The monk understood that if he spent his last moments only fearing the tigers, he would miss the sweetness that still existed right before him. But by tasting the strawberry, by fully experiencing that moment, he discovered something deeper than fear. He discovered presence, the ability to live completely in the present moment. And that is the heart of the story. Because life will always bring difficulties, but hidden among those difficulties are small, beautiful moments waiting to be noticed. And sometimes, the wisest thing we can do is simply pause and taste the strawberry. The monk hanging between two tigers reminds us of something important. Life is often uncertain. Sometimes we worry about dangers behind us, and sometimes we worry about problems waiting ahead. But as the monk discovered with the sweet taste of a single strawberry, peace can still exist in the present moment. And that idea, accepting life as it unfolds, appears again in another ancient Zen story. A story about a quiet farmer who never rushed to judge whether life was good or bad. Our next story is called Maybe, the Farmer and the Horse.
Long ago, in a small and peaceful village surrounded by gentle hills and endless rice fields, there lived a humble farmer. His house was simple, built from old wooden beams and a roof of weathered tiles. Every morning, before the sun fully rose, he would step outside to greet the cool air of the countryside. The villagers knew him well, not because he was wealthy or powerful, but because he was calm. While many people in the village often worried about good fortune or bad luck,
The farmer seemed untouched by such anxieties. His days moved slowly and steadily, like the quiet rhythm of the seasons. He worked his fields with patience. He spoke very little, and when he did speak, his words were always thoughtful. The farmer owned almost nothing: no large land, no fancy tools, no piles of gold. His only valuable possession was a single horse. That horse helped him plow the fields, carry crops to the market, and travel between the nearby villages. Without it, his work would become much harder. Yet the farmer never treated the horse as merely a tool. To him, the animal was a companion, another living being sharing the same journey through life. Every evening, after finishing his work, he would brush the horse's coat and feed it quietly in the fading light of the sunset. Seriously, life was simple, predictable, peaceful, until one morning, everything changed. When the farmer walked to the stable to begin his work for the day, the door was open. The rope lay loose on the ground, and the horse was gone. The farmer stood quietly at the entrance at the empty stable. The morning sun had just begun to rise, casting long golden light across the fields. The rope that once held the horse swayed gently in the breeze. The animal had clearly broken free during the night and run toward the mountains. For a few moments, the farmer simply looked at the empty stable. He did not shout. He did not run after the horse. He simply stood there, breathing slowly, observing what had happened.
Soon, the news spread through the village. In small villages, events travel faster than the wind. Within hours, several neighbors came walking down the dusty road toward the farmer's house. They shook their heads with sympathy. One of them said with a heavy sigh, "What terrible luck! Losing your only horse, this is truly unfortunate." Another neighbor added, "Yes, how will you plow your fields now? How will you carry your crops to the market?" They spoke with the tone of people who believed they clearly understood the situation. But the farmer did not look upset. He did not complain. Instead, he gently nodded and gave a small, calm reply. "Maybe." The neighbors exchanged puzzled glances. Maybe? What kind of answer was that? To them, the situation was obvious. The horse was gone. That meant misfortune.
But the farmer simply returned to his work, as if nothing unusual had happened. He watered his crops. He repaired a wooden fence, and as the sun slowly moved across the sky, the village continued its ordinary rhythm. Yet the story was far from over, because a few days later, something unexpected happened. Several days passed. The farmer continued his routine exactly as before. Every morning he walked into the fields with the same steady pace. Even without the horse, he worked patiently, using simple tools and the strength of his own hands. The neighbors often whispered among themselves. "Poor man," some said, "it must be very difficult now." But the farmer never spoke about the missing horse again. Then, one quiet afternoon, from the distant hills beyond the village, came the faint sound of hooves.
At first it was soft, then louder. The ground began to tremble slightly as a small group of animals approached from the mountain path. Villagers stepped out of their homes to see what was happening. And there, leading the group, was the farmer's horse. But it was no longer alone. Behind it ran several wild horses from the mountains, strong, beautiful, untamed. The runaway horse had returned, and somehow it had brought an entire group of wild horses with it. The animals stopped near the farmer's field, snorting and stomping the ground. The villagers gasped in amazement. Soon the neighbors hurried once again to the farmer's house. This time their faces were filled with excitement rather than sympathy. "What incredible luck!" one of them exclaimed. "You lost one horse, and now you have many."
Another neighbor laughed and said, "This is wonderful. You must be the luckiest man in the village." The farmer listened quietly. Just as before, his expression remained calm. He gently looked at the wild horses standing in the field. Then he gave the same simple answer, "Maybe." Again, the neighbors stared at him in confusion. How could he say maybe to something that was clearly good fortune? But the farmer only smiled faintly and returned to his work, because he understood something the others did not. Life had not finished telling its story yet. The arrival of the wild horses quickly became the main topic of conversation throughout the village. People gathered near the farmer's field just to look at them. To many villagers, the farmer now seemed incredibly fortunate. What had once appeared to be a terrible loss had suddenly turned into great wealth.
But wild horses are not easy to control. They had grown up running freely through the mountains, untouched by ropes or saddles. One morning, the farmer's son decided to try taming one of the wild horses. The villagers watched from a distance. The young man approached one of the strongest horses. But the moment he tried to control it, the wild horse exploded into motion. It bucked violently, throwing him high into the air. He crashed down hard, and his leg was broken. Soon, the neighbors came once again to the farmer's house. "What terrible misfortune," they said. "Your son cannot work now. This is truly bad luck." The farmer listened quietly, and once again he gave the same calm reply, "Maybe." The villagers sighed. They could not understand why he always answered in the same way. But once again, the story of life was not finished, because only a few weeks later, something happened that no one in the village had expected. Several weeks passed. The young man remained at home, his leg wrapped tightly in wooden splints. Walking was painful, and he could no longer help his father in the fields. The farmer continued working alone. Under the burning sun, he tilled the soil, carried water, and repaired the fences by himself. The neighbors watched with sympathy. Many of them still shook their heads when they passed the farm. "Such bad luck," they whispered. "If the boy had not tried to tame that horse, everything would have been fine." Life in the village slowly settled into its usual rhythm again, until one morning, the sound of marching boots echoed along the village road. Soldiers had arrived. A war had broken out in a nearby kingdom. The army was traveling from village to village, recruiting every young man strong enough to fight. The soldiers knocked on every door. They called the young men out into the street. Some mothers cried quietly. Some fathers stood in silence, because everyone understood what this meant. Many of those boys would never return. When the soldiers reached the farmer's house, they saw the young man sitting beside the doorway with his injured leg. One of the soldiers examined the splints and shook his head. "This one cannot march," he said, and just like that, they moved on to the next house. The farmer's son was left behind, safe, alive. Later that day, the neighbors came once again to the farmer's home, but this time their voices were filled with amazement. "What incredible fortune!" one neighbor exclaimed. "If your son had not broken his leg, he would have been taken to war." Another said, "You are truly lucky after all." The farmer listened quietly, just as he always had. The wind moved gently through the fields. The horses grazed calmly nearby. And once again, the farmer gave the same simple answer, "Maybe." The lesson of the farmer. The villagers spent their lives trying to decide what events were good and what events were bad. But the farmer understood something deeper. Life is always changing. What seems like misfortune today may become a blessing tomorrow, and what appears to be good fortune may later bring difficulty. Because the truth is, we rarely see the full story of life while it is still unfolding. The wisdom of the farmer was not about predicting the future. It was about remaining calm in the middle of uncertainty.
not rushing to judge events as good or bad, but accepting that life moves in ways we cannot always understand. This quiet balance of the mind is what many traditions call equanimity, the ability to remain steady even while the world changes around us. Just like the farmer, sometimes the wisest response we can give to life is simply maybe. The farmer understood something that many people forget. Life does not reveal its full meaning right away. What seems like good fortune today may become difficulty tomorrow, and what appears to be bad luck may later protect us in ways we cannot imagine. But there is another lesson just as important. Sometimes the greatest struggles we face are not outside us at all. Sometimes the greatest battle happens inside our own minds. Anger, pride, fear. And that brings us to our final story tonight. A story from the mountains of Japan. A meeting between a warrior and a monk. A moment that reveals the true meaning of heaven and hell. Our final story is called The Samurai and the Monk, Heaven and Hell.
Long ago, in the quiet mountains of Japan, there stood a small temple hidden among cedar trees. It was not a grand temple, no golden statues, no tall gates carved with dragons, just a simple wooden hall, a small garden of stones, and a path made from smooth river rocks. The monks who lived there preferred silence over comfort. Every morning before the sun rose, they would wake to the sound of a wooden bell. They would wash their faces with cold mountain water, sweep the courtyard, and sit quietly in meditation. Sometimes the wind would pass gently through the bamboo leaves. Sometimes birds would sing, and sometimes the entire temple would become so still that even the monks could hear their own breathing. People from nearby villages often walked many miles to visit the temple. They believed the monks possessed wisdom that could calm troubled hearts. But the old master who lived there rarely spoke. He only answered questions when they were truly sincere. And one evening, as the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains, a visitor arrived who would test that wisdom in a very unusual way.
Seriously, the visitor was a samurai. His armor was scratched from many battles. The cloth beneath it had faded with age and travel. At his side hung a sword that had ended many lives. He had fought in wars. He had served powerful lords. He had seen victory and defeat. But inside his mind, something restless had been growing.
For years he had watched men die. Some died in fear, some died in anger, and some died quietly, as if they were not afraid at all. The samurai could not understand this. One question returned to him again and again. What happens after death? Is there really a heaven? Is there really a hell? Or are these only stories told to comfort the weak? The warrior had asked many priests, many scholars, many wandering teachers, but none had given him an answer that satisfied him. Then one day he heard rumors of a monk living deep in the mountains who spoke very little, but whose words carried great truth. So the samurai climbed the long path toward the temple, not to fight, but to ask a single question.
When the samurai entered the temple courtyard, the young monks felt uneasy. Warriors did not usually come to places of meditation. The samurai's footsteps were heavy against the stone path. He approached the old monk who sat quietly beneath a cedar tree. The monk's posture was straight. His hands rested calmly in his lap. His eyes were half closed, as if he were listening to something deeper than sound. The samurai stood before him and spoke firmly. "Old monk." The monk slowly opened his eyes. "Yes." The samurai crossed his arms.
I have traveled far to ask you something.
Seriously, the monk nodded, then asked. The warrior looked directly at him. His voice was strong and direct. Tell me the difference between heaven and hell. The young monk stopped sweeping the courtyard. Even the wind seemed to pause among the trees. Everyone waited for the old monk's answer. But instead of answering, the monk studied the warrior carefully. From the sword at his side, to the tension in his shoulders, to the anger hidden behind his eyes. Then the monk laughed quietly and said something that shocked everyone.
"You are a samurai," the monk said calmly. The warrior nodded. "Yes." The monk tilted his head and said, "A soldier like you wishes to understand heaven and hell." The samurai's expression hardened. The monk continued softly, "You look strong, but you seem rather foolish." The courtyard became completely silent. No one had ever spoken to the samurai that way. His face turned red with anger. His hand moved instantly toward his sword. With a sharp metallic sound, the blade left its sheath. The sword glimmered under the evening sun. The warrior raised it high above the monk. The young monks gasped in fear, but the old monk did not move. He did not defend himself, he did not run. He simply looked calmly into the warrior's furious eyes. Then he spoke. "That is hell." The samurai froze. His sword remained raised in the air, but the monk's words echoed inside his mind. "That is hell." Suddenly, the warrior saw himself clearly. A man controlled by anger. A man ready to kill an old monk simply because his pride had been touched. The fire of rage inside his chest began to fade. His breathing slowed. The sword felt heavier in his hand. Slowly, very slowly, the samurai lowered the blade. The metal returned to its sheath with a quiet sound. The courtyard became peaceful again. The monk smiled gently. "And that," he said softly, "is heaven." The samurai bowed deeply. For the first time in many years, his mind felt lighter. He understood now.
Heaven and hell were not distant places. They were born inside the human mind. Every moment we choose anger, pride, and hatred, we step into hell. And every moment we choose calm, awareness, and compassion, we step into heaven. The samurai turned and walked down the mountain path, but he was not the same warrior who had climbed it, because the greatest battle he had ever fought was not against another man. It was against his own anger. And for the first time, he had won. And so tonight, we heard 3 quiet stories. The monk and the strawberry, reminding us to taste the present moment. Maybe the farmer and the horse, teaching us not to judge life too quickly. The samurai and the monk, revealing that heaven and hell begin inside the mind. Different stories, different places, but all pointing toward the same quiet wisdom. Peace is not something we find outside ourselves. It is something we discover within. So now, take one more slow breath. Let the stories fade gently into the night and allow your mind to rest. Good night.